Bias is a mental shortcut or prejudice that skews objective judgment, often causing us to see what we expect rather than what is actually happening. During a cyber incident, this can lead to tunnel vision, where you might ignore critical evidence or misinterpret an attacker's motives. Everyone is subject to some form of bias without actively knowing it. And yes, it happened to me several times in my career so far, and I'm sure I will also be confronted with it again, even though I've been doing this work for many years now. The reason I would like to cover the subject today is because it helps you understand why certain attacks actually work the way they worked. But it will also give you some practical examples on several bias types so that you can work out your strategy to fight against the biases you are likely to face. But so will all of your stakeholders in the Incident Commander ecosystem. Let's dive straight into it. It all started when a finance employee at FACC received an email that appeared to be from the CEO, Walter Stephan. The email was highly sophisticated. The attackers had likely breached the company's email servers earlier to study the CEO's writing style, tone, and the company's internal jargon. Why did the initial contact work? Well, the threat actor impersonating the company's CEO claimed the company was involved in a highly confidential, urgent acquisition project. The employee was instructed to transfer a massive sum of money to an overseas account to facilitate the deal. Because of the secrecy and the CEO's direct order, the employee felt pressure to bypass standard verification steps. The financial damage was huge. FACC ended up wiring approximately 45 million, which is about 56 million US dollars, to attacker-controlled accounts primarily in Slovakia and Asia, and more specifically, China. So how was the authority bias at work here? This incident is a classic working example of a CEO fraud case. First, they used the secret project narrative. By framing the transfer as part of a secret acquisition, the threat actors gave the employee a logical reason why they shouldn't talk to their direct supervisor or follow the usual public protocols. The second reason this scheme worked, well, that was basically the executive pressure. In many corporate cultures, questioning a direct, urgent request from the CEO is seen as potentially career limiting. The threat actor exploited this cultural fear. And finally, the isolation of the target. The attackers targeted a specific individual in the finance department, effectively isolating them from the collective intelligence of the team. The second use case that I would like to review covers two forms of biases simultaneously, namely confirmation bias and anchoring bias. The story comes from the Sony hack in 2014, where Sony Pictures was hit by a massive cyber attack that wiped servers, leaked unreleased movies, and exposed sensitive employee emails. As the investigation began, the security teams and the public quickly focused on one single narrative: North Korea. Because North Korea had vocally protested the film The Interview, which was a comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un, the FBI and the investigators anchored to the idea that this was actually a state-sponsored retaliation. So how did the confirmation bias take over? Well, investigators began looking for evidence that pointed to North Korea. When they found snippets of Korean language in the malware code and the IP addresses that had been used previously in North Korean attacks, they viewed it as a slam dunk. However, they ignored disconfirming evidence. First, several independent security researchers pointed out that the code was actually a mix of different languages and old hacking tools easily found on the dark web. Secondly, the initial ransomware demands didn't mention the movie The Interview at all. They were all about money and extortion. And finally, the Guardians of Peace, the group actually claiming the credit for this, used social media in a way that didn't match typical North Korean state actor behavior. As a result, by solely focusing on the North Korean narrative, the investigators may have missed the possibility of an insider threat. Some experts still argue today that a disgruntled former employee likely provided the keys to the kingdom, as the attackers knew exactly where the most sensitive folders were located, something an external state actor would struggle to find so quickly. The third example of bias I wanted to present today. For this, we will take the Equifax breach from 2017. The scenario is basically where a critical vulnerability, struts, was announced, and Equifax was actually told to patch it. What was the bias that locked in here? Leadership suffered from optimism bias. They believed their internal systems were robust enough that a single unpatched server wouldn't lead to a total catastrophe. They assumed, we're a giant credit bureau. Our perimeter is too strong for a basic exploit to ruin us. That single, it won't happen to us mindset led to the exposure of the private data of 147 million people. Let's look at two more heavy hitters from the bias library, the sunk cost fallacy and the hindsight bias. Both of these have caused multi-million-dollar disasters in the cybersecurity world so far. Let's look at the sunk cost fallacy, or the digging a deeper hole bias. The concept here is the tendency to continue investing in a losing proposition, such as a project, a vendor, or a strategy, because of the resources already spent, rather than cutting losses and moving to a better solution. The example use case here will be the legacy system trap. A major European financial institution, similar to the TSB bank migration failure in 2018, spent 5 years and hundreds of millions of euros building a custom internal platform. Halfway through, it became clear the platform was riddled with vulnerabilities and didn't scale with modern cloud tech. So how was the bias in action here? Because leadership had already promised the board a state-of-the-art internal system and spent 70% of the budget, they refused to scrap it for a cheaper, more secure off-the-shelf solution. They anchored to their initial investment. As a result, they launched a flawed system. Within weeks, it suffered a massive outage and a data breach. The cost to fix the sunk system was triple the cost of what a new system would have been. So what's the lesson here? Your only objective should be the security of the future and not just justifying the mistakes of the past. Now let's turn to the hindsight bias, or the I knew it all along effect. The concept here is the inclination after an event has occurred to see as having been predictable, despite there having been little or no objective basis for predicting this. The example use case I'm going to use here is the Target data breach in 2013. After the Target breach, where 40 million credit card numbers were stolen, the media and armchair experts attacked the security team. They pointed to a specific alert from a security tool, FireEye in that time, that had flagged the attacker's movements. The bias in action here was, well, the alert was right there. How could you be so stupid to ignore it? This is an example of hindsight bias. The reality at the time, on the day of the breach, that security team was likely receiving thousands of alerts per day. Most of them, as it happens very often, false positives or noise. To the team at that moment, the breach alert looked maybe exactly like the same 500 other ignore alerts they saw every single morning. As a result, the management fired the CIO and revamped the department. But they were fixing a prediction problem that didn't actually exist. They were suffering from alert fatigue. The lesson about this one is Security isn't about finding the one true alert. It's about managing the overwhelming noise so the truth can actually be seen. The last bias I want to cover is the not invented here bias, which is a form of group bias. The concept here is a tendency for organizations to avoid using perfectly good products or research because they originated from outside the company. The example use case I'm going to use here is the Juniper Networks backdoor from 2015. Juniper Networks, a major networking giant, decided to modify a random generator, a dual EC DRBG for the technical people out there, for the encryption, rather than the industry standard version. The bias in action here, there's often a prideful belief in big tech firms that engineers are smarter than industry standards. They choose to tweak the math internally. As a result, because they strayed from the vetted peer-reviewed standard, they inadvertently left a backdoor that allowed unauthorized users, in this case suspected state actors, to decrypt VPN traffic for years. The lesson here is don't roll your own crypto. Arrogance in the face of established security standards is a recipe for disaster. In summary, bias comes in so many forms and affects the way we think and might also affect some of our decision making if we're not careful. One of the things that worked well for me is whenever I was facing or suspecting a bias in the cases I was working, was to also diversify the number of people in getting opinions and potentially bringing some external expertise to come in and basically give a second opinion view of what you've already looked at, especially when you're stuck in an investigation. One of the best ways to address this challenge is to use what I call the zero trust policy in your major incidents. Regardless of what statements some of your victims might make, or some of the theories that your colleagues might be throwing at you from all kinds of different directions, let the evidence tell you the story is my main guiding principle. It is good to have theories and hypotheses when starting an investigation, but in the end, it's the evidence that's going to give you what actually really happened. Let's have some final thoughts here. We were talking about navigating the human firewall. As we've seen through the lens of FACC, Sony, and Equifax, the most sophisticated hacks often don't target code. They target the cognitive shortcuts our brain uses to make sense of the world. Whether it's the pressure of authority bias, the tunnel vision of confirmation bias, or the pride of the not invented here, these mental loops are the invisible vulnerabilities in every incident commander's ecosystem. So what are some of the key takeaways for your own strategy? First, audit your culture. Recognize that executive pressure and legacy pride are basically big security risks. If your team is too afraid to question a CEO's email or too invested in a failing system, such as the sunk cost fallacy I mentioned, you're already compromised. Second, combat alert fatigue. Remember the target breach. Don't let hindsight bias trick you into thinking the smoking gun was obvious. Build systems that filter the noise so your team can focus on signals. The second opinion rule is really about when an investigation stalls. The culprit is often a collective blind spot. Bring in external eyes or a red team to intentionally challenge your current team's hypotheses. If there's one golden rule for incident commanders you should remember, it would be trust the evidence, not the narrative. Adopting a zero trust mindset towards your own assumptions is really your best defense. Hypotheses are helpful starting points, but they're just maps. Finally, the evidence is just going to be the actual terrain. By staying aware of these biases, you don't just become a better incident commander, you become a more grounded leader in the heat of a crisis.